Good evening and welcome back to Checkpoint. So yesterday, the 1st of September, that 16% value-added tax on all petroleum products came into effect. This despite attempts by members of the National Assembly last week passing amendments on the finance bill to yet again, for the third time, push implementation of this particular legislation. And many have called them out for being pretentious with their agenda, keep pushing and postponing a problem instead of dealing with it. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. And joining me in studio is David Ndi, who is an economist. Thank you, sir, for making time for Checkpoint.
Okay.
We've heard a lot about this. I'm sure you have, and tracked also the conversation on social media. The 16% value-added tax on petroleum products, in your view, what's the implication of this? Is it only, as we've seen some people narrow it down to just those driving and matatu, or does it have a ripple further reaching effect?
It does have a bigger effect because everybody uses transport. So what you see is an attempt by government to tax, actually, to widen the tax net. Because, you know, a big chunk of our economy is what you might call semi-formal. So if you want to, in their view, to raise more revenue, then you need to tax things which catch everyone. And because everyone uses transport, this is a product. It's also a tax which is easy to collect because you only have a few petroleum dealers, and therefore it's an easy tax to administer. But obviously, I think whether you are able to raise more revenue on it is questionable, actually, because you see, people's incomes haven't changed. Okay, so if my budget for transport goes up, my budget for something else goes down. And the budget of that thing which goes down was also being taxed. Okay?
Yeah.
So the budget for transport goes up, the budget for household shopping goes down, so you collect more, or my budget on airtime, for instance, goes down.
Yes.
So there is no certainty that you actually the net effect is that you're going to raise more revenue.
Yeah, it may stay stagnant because the government says they need, and we're seeing some of those changes, and what Kenyans will have to dig deeper into their pockets to be able to get diesel, super, or kerosene. The government has a deficit. They need to raise revenue. So in your view, what is it that should be considered? How can they do it?
You know, Sophie, this is the consequence of living beyond its means. The government has been living beyond its means for several years. In fact, this government has been spending 40% more than its income for all of its first term. You know, for 5 years, you're spending 40% more of your income. So it has actually reached to a point where that borrowing is unsustainable.
Yeah.
So the pressure to reduce the deficit and to do what is now being called fiscal consolidation or austerity is coming from its creditors.
Like?
Mostly from the markets. You see, I saw an article yesterday or the day before talking about all the African countries, many countries which are going into financial distress, and many of them who are borrowers of have Eurobond, have issued Eurobonds like ourselves. Right. And it was by one of the big banks, I think Citibank, and it singled out two countries as having challenges of fiscal consolidation, Zambia and Kenya. So what you're seeing is the fact that the government now needs to keep refinancing its market debt. And to refinance that debt, the market has particular expectations.
Right.
And they look at the credit rating sort of thing. They look at your macro economic variables. And they have decided that the only way that countries like Kenya, are going to be able to sustain their debt is if they shrink their deficit. So that's where the pressure is coming from. There is also a change in the global financial environment. You are seeing a retreat from emerging markets. I saw, I think yesterday or the day before, the yields on Zambian Eurobonds at something like 15%. When Zambia was issuing those bonds, and as we are issuing the Eurobonds, the rates were about 6 or 7%. In fact, we issued about 6 or 7%.
Right.
So it means if we go back to refinance, you are beginning to talk with the market about rates above 10%.
Yes.
10, 12%. So because the US interest rates are rising, the global market changes. And when countries like ours go out, have exposed themselves to the market, these are the risks that you have exposed yourself to.
Right.
And these risks are now crystallizing.
So let me ask you this, and as far as the members of parliament, in your view, are they being dishonest? Because legislation passed in 2013, delayed for 3 years, postponed those amendments, then again for 2, and now on the table is a bill seeking to push this further. We'll see if the president will assent to these proposals or not. Do you think they're being dishonest, or were they hoping there'd be a change in as far as policy that would then cushion mwananchi?
I don't think they're being dishonest. But I think they are not well informed. It's a problem of incoherence. This government is completely incoherent as far as its economic management is concerned and its policy concerned. These same MPs are the ones who have been cheerleaders of this excessive reckless borrowing to finance mega projects.
Right.
As the Treasury and the government are talking about cutting the budget deficit, drastically cutting the budget deficit. They're talking about freezing. The president is talking about freezing development projects. But at the same time, he's going to China and talking about renegotiating a new financing of 380 billion shillings for the SGR. Just to illustrate, there was a bill put in Parliament, which I see people debating, to limit public debt to 6 trillion shillings.
Yes.
Now, there is already limits on public debt, which Parliament already has all the instruments it needs to limit public borrowing. In 2014, the same Parliament increased the limit on external borrowing to 2.5 trillion shillings, from 1.2 to 2 trillion shillings to accommodate the mega projects. Now, that ceiling has been breached. Now, our public external debt is now excess of 2.5 trillion. So, and the president is out to borrow another 380 billion shillings. And the same MPs are cheering that.
Yeah.
So it's a much more
complex.
It's not complex. This country has lost financial and economic sense. And I've been saying this for several years. Yeah, the things we are doing do not make economic and financial sense.
Right. And yet you feel that